The wind of the prairie carried with it a silence heavy as iron, the kind of silence that only arrives before something grand and unexplainable. That night, under the pale glow of the moon, a man without home, without past, and without future, bent down to shield a fragile life he had stumbled upon. A native baby, trembling in the cold, abandoned to the merciless desert night. With nothing but a worn-out blanket, the only thing he still owned, he wrapped the child against his chest, surrendering his last piece of warmth. What he didn't know was that this act, simple yet profound, would echo far beyond that lonely night. In the Old West, every gesture was weighed not just by survival, but by honor. Strangers could turn into legends with a single choice, and outcasts could become the unexpected protectors of a people. The man, who had been invisible to the world, was about to be seen in a way that even he could never imagine. His sacrifice, his silent offering, was more than an act of compassion. It was a statement to the earth itself that life, no matter how fragile, deserved protection. At dawn, when the first light cut across the plains, 100 warriors appeared from the edge of the valley. They did not come with the noise of drums or the threat of arrows, but with the silence of something greater, respect. They stood, watching, neither raising their weapons nor breaking the quiet. To them, the man who had been nothing was now a guardian, a figure who had placed the life of a native child above his own survival. The silence of those warriors spoke louder than any battle cry. It was not submission, nor was it suspicion. It was acknowledgement. They had seen men fight for gold, for land, for pride, but rarely for the sake of a helpless child. This quiet moment carved itself into the memory of the tribe, and into the destiny of the wanderer who thought he had lost everything. And so, the story begins. A homeless man, stripped of all possessions, offering his last blanket in the dead of night, only to awaken to the gaze of 100 warriors, silent and unyielding. A silence that did not condemn him, but transformed him. Because in the wild lands of the West, where every man's worth was measured in blood and fire, it was compassion that carried the power to move nations. The man had long been a shadow, drifting through the frontier towns, known only as the nameless drifter who traded silence for bread and his labor for a night of rest in a barn. No one asked where he came from, and he gave no answer. His beard was rough, his eyes hollow, and his clothes tattered from years of wandering the barren trails. Yet beneath the dust and weariness, there was something untold, a story waiting for its moment to break through. That night, as he stumbled across the desert plain, fate brought him face to face with a bundle of life, abandoned to die. The baby's cries were faint, nearly swallowed by the wind. Wrapped in scraps of hide, the child trembled as though the cold itself wanted to erase it from existence. The man stood frozen, torn between walking on and surrendering to instinct. He had nothing, no home, no food, no fire, and yet, as he knelt and pressed his last possession, a fragile blanket, against the infant's fragile body, something inside him stirred. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of responsibility, an anchor pulling him back from his endless drifting. All through the night, he cradled the baby against his chest, shielding it with his body against the sharp desert air. Memories of his own childhood flickered, memories of a mother's lullaby, of warmth he once knew but had long buried beneath layers of regret and exile. He whispered words that no one else would hear, promises to a child who did not know his name. In that moment, he was not a beggar, not a drifter, not a forgotten soul. He was a guardian. As the stars faded, the first light of dawn stretched across the land, and he rose, exhausted, but with a strange resolve. He looked down at the baby, still breathing, still alive, and realized that in saving this child, he had saved himself from the slow death of invisibility. But he did not yet know what awaited him on the ridge. The silent eyes of 100 warriors who had watched every moment from the shadows of the night. The ground seemed to tremble as they stepped forward, their faces painted in the colors of battle, yet their voices withheld. The man tightened his grip around the child, unsure if he had trespassed against some sacred law. His heart thundered louder than the earth beneath his boots. He braced himself for judgment, unaware that the judgment had already been passed, not in anger, but in reverence. The warriors' silence was heavier than any storm. They formed a circle, their bows at their sides, their horses restless yet restrained. In the Old West, silence could mean death, but this silence felt different, like a song unsung, waiting for the right moment to break free. The man could not meet their eyes, yet he did not run. He knew there was nowhere to go, and even if there had been, he would not abandon the child. His blanket was thin, his strength fading, but his resolve rooted him to the ground like an old oak in a storm. The chief, a tall figure with braids streaked with gray, stepped forward. His gaze was unyielding, sharp as an arrow, yet not cruel. He looked at the baby first, then at the man holding it, and finally at the blanket, the symbol of sacrifice. In that simple act, the chief saw something no words could explain. A soul who had given everything, not for gold, not for pride, but for life itself. The tribe understood this language, for they knew that the land itself only honored those willing to give what little they had. For what felt like hours, no word was spoken. The man's arms ached, his eyes burned from the night without sleep, and still he held the baby, as though letting go would mean the end of the world. When at last the chief raised his hand, the warriors lowered their heads. Not in submission, not in pity, but in recognition. A stranger had stepped into their story, and by his choice, he had become part of it. The man was guided to the camp, though he expected nothing but suspicion. Yet when he crossed the threshold of their fires, the people did not push him away. Women gathered to take the child, wrapping it in furs, while others brought water and food for the drifter who had given away all he had. Still, he ate little, his eyes fixed on the baby, as though afraid that turning away would undo the fragile thread of life he had protected through the night. By the time the sun had risen high, the man realized that his world had shifted. He had been a ghost, a wanderer unseen by the world. Yet now 100 warriors and an entire tribe had witnessed him. They had seen his act, and in their silence, they had spoken the truth, that sometimes even the lowest of men could rise to the highest of honors, not by words, not by power, but by sacrifice. Night fell once more, and the firelight flickered against the walls of the camp. The man sat apart, his back against a post, watching shadows dance across the ground. He felt like an intruder, a ghost drifting into a world that was not his own. Yet every so often, someone would glance at him, not with disdain, but with a quiet curiosity, as though trying to read the story carved into his worn face. The baby, now cradled safely in the arms of the women, slept in peace. For the first time, the man allowed his lungs to release a breath he did not know he had been holding. But peace in the West was never lasting. Whispers rose in the camp, rumors of raiders prowling the edges of their land, waiting for weakness. The tribe had faced loss before, and every life, even that of a child, carried the weight of their future. The man did not understand their language, but he understood fear. He saw it in the way the warriors sharpened their blades by the fire, in the way the mothers clutched their children closer when the wind howled. The land itself seemed to tremble with the memory of bloodshed. The drifter knew he had no place among them. He had been nothing but a wanderer, a man stripped of family, land, and purpose. Yet something inside him refused to remain silent. He could not walk away now, not after what he had seen, not after holding that child against his chest. He approached the chief, his hands trembling, and though words were scarce, his intent was clear. He offered himself, not as a warrior, for he had no weapon, but as a shield, the same shield he had been in the desert night. The chief studied him in the glow of the flames, the fire reflecting in his eyes. He saw no pride in the drifter, no hunger for glory, only a man who had nothing left but the courage to stand. In the Old West, men who had nothing often proved to be the most dangerous, for fear no longer chained them. After a long silence, the chief gave a nod. A place would be given to him, not as a guest, not yet as a brother, but as a man who had proven his worth through sacrifice. And so, beneath the stars that stretched endless across the plains, the drifter remained by the fire, no longer unseen, no longer forgotten. He had stepped into the current of a story larger than his own, a story written in silence, sacrifice, and the echoes of footsteps long buried in the dust. What began as an act of compassion had now bound him to a destiny he could neither predict nor escape. Days passed, and the man found himself drawn deeper into the rhythms of the tribe. He worked where work was needed, hauling water, mending shelters, tending to the horses. The people watched him closely, but he never faltered. Though he spoke little, his actions carried weight, and in the West, deeds often spoke louder than words. Slowly, the whispers of doubt began to fade, replaced by a reluctant respect for the drifter who had offered his last blanket to a child not his own. Yet trust was not given lightly. Some of the younger warriors glared at him, questioning why a stranger, a beggar with no name, should be welcomed among them. They remembered the scars of betrayal, the cruelty of settlers who had taken land and life. To them, the drifter was still an outsider, a shadow walking dangerously close to the fire. But the elders held firm. The man had proven himself in a language older than words, the language of sacrifice. One morning, before the sun rose, the tribe prepared for what they feared most, an attack from beyond the ridge. The air was tense, the horses restless, the children hushed. The man felt it too, the same dread that had followed him for years, the weight of battles he had never fought but had witnessed from afar. And yet, for the first time, he did not feel like running. He felt the pull of belonging, fragile but real, and he knew that his place was not behind the fires, but the edge of the camp where danger would strike first. The chief noticed. He placed a spear into the drifter's hands, not as a gift, but as a test. The wood felt heavy, foreign, and yet strangely familiar, as though it had been waiting for him. The man gripped it tight, his knuckles pale, his heart racing with both fear and resolve. He had been invisible to the world for too long, but now, with the tribe watching, he stood tall. He was no warrior, not yet, but he was willing to bleed. And in the Old West, that willingness was often enough. As the horizon burned red with the first light of dawn, the man found himself shoulder to shoulder with 100 warriors, their silence echoing louder than drums. He looked at the baby, swaddled in furs, safe by the fire, and he felt something rise within him, a strength he did not know he carried. The drifter had been many things, a beggar, a ghost, a forgotten soul. But now, beneath the endless sky, he was something more. He was a man ready to fight for a story that was no longer just his own. The morning stretched heavy with silence, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk circling above. The drifter stood among the warriors, gripping the spear as though it were the final anchor to his soul. He had no armor, no years of training, no claim to their heritage, but he had something that few men carried, nothing left to lose. That emptiness, once his burden, now burned inside him like fire, pushing him forward when fear tried to hold him back. He glanced at the faces around him, painted with lines of war, and realized that he was no longer invisible. Beyond the ridge, shadows began to move. The raiders were coming, their torches flickering like serpents in the dawn. The earth trembled under the pounding of hooves, and for a fleeting moment, the drifter wondered if he had been foolish to stay. Yet when his eyes fell upon the child he had saved, the same child who now represented the heartbeat of an entire people, his doubt vanished. The weight of that fragile life gave him more strength than any weapon could provide. He no longer thought of himself as a beggar or a wanderer. He was a shield, and a shield does not abandon its purpose. The warriors raised their weapons, their silence unbroken, and the drifter followed suit. Sweat slid down his back, his pulse thundered in his ears, but he did not falter. The raiders crested the ridge, their cries echoing through the valley, expecting fear, expecting retreat. Instead, they found 100 warriors standing unmoved, and among them, a man who did not belong, yet refused to step aside. That sight alone gave the attackers pause, for courage, when multiplied, becomes its own weapon. The first arrow was loosed, cutting through the air like a scream. The drifter flinched but held his ground. He had always imagined himself a coward, a man unworthy of any cause. Yet here he was, standing at the very front. Something inside him broke free, the chains of years spent hiding from life snapping in an instant. He roared, not in words but in defiance, and his voice, raw and unshaped, carried across the battlefield like a challenge. The warriors around him felt it, the tribe felt it, and even the raiders heard it. When the clash came, it was not the drifter who stepped back. It was the enemy. The West had always tested men, stripping them to their bones to reveal what lay beneath. And in that moment, the man who had been forgotten by the world proved that even the lowest soul could stand tall when life demanded it. The spear in his hand was no longer foreign. It was an extension of the vow he had made in the cold desert night, to protect life, even at the cost of his own. The battle raged across the plain, dust rising in clouds, cries echoing like thunder. Arrows flew, steel clashed, and the land itself seemed to shake beneath the fury. The drifter fought not with skill but with desperation, each strike born from the memory of the child's trembling body in his arms. He was clumsy, untrained, but relentless, and in the chaos of war, relentlessness often outweighed finesse. He stumbled, bled, and yet kept rising, each fall met with the strength of a man who refused to be erased again. The warriors noticed. At first, they had doubted him, watching for weakness, waiting for the moment he would turn and flee. But as the fight pressed on, they saw him stand when others fell, saw him shield those beside him, saw him face men stronger and faster without hesitation. Their silence broke, not in words, but in the rhythm of their strikes aligning with his, as though they had accepted him into their circle. The drifter, once an outsider, now moved as part of the tribe, his breath and blood mingling with theirs. The raiders, expecting an easy conquest, found themselves staggering against the resistance. For every charge they made, the line held firm, and the nameless man stood at its center like a post rooted in the earth. He remembered hunger, cold, and loneliness, and he poured all of it into each swing of the spear. His past had made him empty, but that emptiness was now his strength. It left no room for fear. Amid the chaos, the chief watched closely. He had seen countless battles, countless men rise and fall, but few fought with the fire of one who had nothing. The drifter reminded him of something ancient, something the land itself whispered. That greatness often came not from birthright, but from sacrifice. As blood stained the earth, the chief knew this man's story had already become part of theirs, woven into the very song of survival. When the raiders finally retreated, dragging their wounded into the horizon, the tribe stood victorious, battered but unbroken. The drifter collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving, his body bruised and bleeding. Yet in his exhaustion, there was no shame. He had not run, he had not faltered, and in the eyes of the people, he was no longer nameless. He had proven himself in the harshest language of the West, through battle, sacrifice, and unyielding courage. The camp was quiet after the battle, the air heavy with the smell of smoke and blood. Warriors tended to their wounds, mothers whispered prayers over their children, and the elders traced the sky with solemn eyes, thanking the spirits for survival. In the center of it all sat the drifter, his hands trembling, his body weak, but his spirit still burning with the echo of the fight. He had stood among them, bled among them, and in that silence, something had changed. The man who had once been a ghost on the trails was now part of their story. Women brought him water, pressing it into his palms, while children peeked curiously from behind their mother's skirts. He was no longer a stranger, no longer just the beggar who had wandered into their land. To them, he was the man who had chosen to stand when it would have been easier to run. Their culture measured worth not by possessions or wealth, but by sacrifice and courage, and he had given both without hesitation. In that measure, he was rich. The chief approached, his steps slow, deliberate. In his hands, he carried a necklace of carved bone, a symbol passed only to those the tribe considered protectors. He lowered it gently around the drifter's neck, his voice deep, speaking words the man could not understand, but the meaning was clear. This was no longer a camp he had stumbled upon. It was now his home. The tribe had claimed him, and in turn, he had claimed them. For the drifter, the moment was overwhelming. For years, he had wandered invisible, carrying only the weight of survival. But now, the silence of 100 warriors had spoken louder than any voice. He was seen, not as a burden, not as an intruder, but as a man worthy of standing beside them. The weight of the necklace pressed against his chest like the weight of responsibility, and strangely, it did not feel heavy. It felt like belonging. That night, the tribe sang around the fire, their voices rising to the stars. The drifter sat among them, still unsure of the words, but humming to the rhythm, letting the sound wash over him. The baby he had once shielded with his only blanket slept peacefully by the flames. For the first time in his life, the drifter realized he was no longer alone. He had given all he had, and in return, he had been given something greater than he ever imagined. A place, a name, a family carved into the wild lands of the West. But the West was never without trials, and peace was always fleeting. Days after the victory, scouts returned with grim news. The raiders had not vanished, they had only retreated. They would gather again, stronger, hungrier, and this time, they would return with vengeance. Fear rippled through the camp like a cold wind. The tribe knew the fight was not over. It had only just begun. The drifter listened to their whispers, the firelight reflecting in his weary eyes. Once, he would have left at the first sign of danger, slipping back into the shadows of the land. But now, leaving was unthinkable. He had fought for them, bled for them, and he would not abandon them to face the storm alone. His life had been empty until he placed that blanket around the child, but now it was bound with threads stronger than blood. He was tied to this people, to their fate, and to the land itself. The chief called a council, his voice low but firm. He spoke of strategy, of unity, of preparing not just for defense, but for survival. The drifter sat among the warriors, still unsure if he deserved such a place. Yet no one pushed him aside. Instead, they looked to him, remembering how he had stood in the first battle. He had no great wisdom, no long history of leadership, but his silence was not that of ignorance. It was the silence of a man who knew the value of listening before speaking. When at last he rose to speak, his voice cracked, low and uncertain, yet it carried through the circle like a steady flame. He spoke not of glory or vengeance, but of the night he held the child in the desert, of the promise he made in silence. His words were clumsy, but his heart was laid bare, and that truth struck deeper than eloquence. He had nothing to offer but himself, and sometimes that was enough. The warriors nodded. The elders bowed their heads, and the tribe, once cautious of the nameless drifter, now looked at him with something more than respect. They saw in him a reflection of their own struggle, survival through sacrifice, strength born from suffering, and hope rising from the ashes of despair. The West had given him nothing but pain, yet he had turned it into loyalty. And in that loyalty, the tribe found courage. The nights grew colder, and the tension in the camp grew heavier with each passing day. Scouts returned again and again with reports. The raiders were gathering in greater numbers, their campfires blazing on the horizon like warning beacons. The tribe knew war was coming, and this time, the cost would be far greater. The drifter walked among them, feeling the weight of every gaze, every whispered prayer, every silent fear. He was no longer unseen. Now, eyes turned to him not with suspicion, but with expectation. In the quiet before dawn, he sat alone at the edge of the camp, staring into the vast emptiness of the plains. Memories clawed at him, the years of wandering without purpose, the hunger that gnawed at his belly, the loneliness that crushed his spirit. He had once believed he was cursed to vanish without leaving a trace in the world. Yet now, that same world had placed a child in his arms, a tribe at his side, and a battle before him. Fate had pulled him out of the shadows, and there was no turning back. The chief joined him, carrying a pipe carved with symbols older than memory. Together they shared the silence, the smoke rising into the sky like a prayer. The chief's words were simple. A man becomes what he chooses to protect. The drifter understood. He had once been a man who protected nothing, not even himself. But now he carried the weight of lives, and in that burden, he had found a reason to stand. When dawn came, preparations began. Spears were sharpened, bows strung, horses saddled. The drifter helped where he could, his hands steady despite the storm inside his chest. He watched the baby, swaddled and safe, and felt the promise burn brighter in his soul. That child was more than a life. He was the symbol of everything the drifter had lost and everything he now stood to gain, redemption, belonging, and the chance to matter. As the sun climbed high, the raiders appeared, a dark tide rolling across the land. They came with fire, with fury, with vengeance burning in their eyes. The tribe formed their line, unyielding, unafraid, and at the center stood the Drifter, once nameless, once forgotten, now ready to carve his place into history. His grip tightened around his spear, and he whispered to himself words he had not spoken in years. Not this time. Not while I still breathe. The clash was thunder. The raiders charged like a storm, and the warriors met them with silence sharp as steel. Dust and smoke rose into the sky, the air filled with the sound of screams and the pounding of hooves. At the heart of it all, the Drifter fought with a fire born not of skill, but of sheer will. Every strike was fueled by the memory of his own suffering, every block by the promise he made beneath the desert stars. He was struck down, rose again, and struck harder. Blood ran from his brow. His body faltered, yet his spirit did not break. Around him, the warriors fought as one, their rhythm flowing like the rivers of their ancestors. And though the raiders pressed with fury, they could not shatter the line. The Drifter's roar carried above the chaos, a voice once lost to silence, now commanding the battlefield. His defiance spread through the tribe like fire through dry grass. At the height of the battle, the enemy leader came forth, a towering figure clad in scars and rage. The Drifter faced him, heart pounding, hands trembling. He knew he was no match in strength or skill, but he also knew he carried something the raider did not: the weight of every soul behind him. The fight was brutal, raw, each blow threatening to end him. Yet with the last of his strength, the Drifter drove his spear forward, and the raider fell. The battlefield grew still. The raiders, seeing their leader fall, faltered and broke, retreating into the horizon with cries of defeat. The tribe stood victorious, battered and bloodied, but alive. And in the center of it all, the Drifter collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving, his vision blurred. Yet in that exhaustion, there was triumph. He had not only survived, he had given them survival. The chief lifted him by the shoulders, raising his hand to the sky. The tribe's voices rose in unison, a chorus of honor and gratitude. The man who had once been nameless was nameless no longer. He was a protector, a brother, a legend written not in wealth or glory, but in sacrifice. And as the firelight later danced against his weary face, the Drifter realized that the silence of 100 warriors had been broken, not by words, but by the story they would carry of him for generations to come. The dust of the battlefield eventually settled, but the echo of that day lived on in every heart that had witnessed it. The Drifter, once invisible to the world, had become the unlikeliest of legends, not because he sought glory, but because he chose to protect what he could have easily ignored. His story reminds us that true strength does not come from wealth, weapons, or titles, but from the courage to give when you have nothing left to offer. In the silence of 100 warriors, he found recognition. In his sacrifice, he found redemption. The West was a land that tested men to their core, stripping away pretense until only truth remained. And the truth of this man was simple. He had been a wanderer, lost himself in the world, but one act of compassion gave his life purpose. That is the hidden law of life. Sometimes, the smallest decision carries the power to change not just your fate, but the fate of countless others. A single blanket, offered in the cold, became the spark that lit the fire of a tribe's survival. His journey leaves us with a question worth carrying. How often do we underestimate the weight of our choices? How often do we believe ourselves powerless, forgetting that even the broken and forgotten can alter the course of history with a single act of selflessness? The Drifter's legacy is not bound to the West alone. It is a truth for every age, every land, and every soul that dares to believe that sacrifice is not loss, but the seed of transformation. As the story closes, imagine the image of that nameless man standing before 100 silent warriors, not as a beggar, not as a stranger, but as one of them. He did not earn his place through bloodline or wealth, but through the quiet power of compassion. That is the kind of legacy worth remembering, the kind that whispers across generations that greatness is not given, is chosen. If this story touched you, let it remind you of the power of your own choices. Share your thoughts in the comments, because every reflection deepens the legacy of this tale. And if you want to walk further into the heart of the Old West and uncover more stories like this, subscribe to the channel and leave your mark with a like. Your voice keeps these stories alive, and together, we make sure that courage, sacrifice, and honor are never forgotten.